Well, everyone, I think we're ready to move on to our second presentation. This presentation is by Steven Stetzler and Mario Juric, and it's a scalable cloud-based analysis platform for survey astronomy. Hello, Steven. I'm going to let you take it away.
Yeah, sure. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, I'm in presentation mode. If it doesn't look right, then yell. Yeah. Hello, everybody. I am Steven Stetzler. I am a graduate student at the University of Washington in the astronomy department, and I'm presenting some work I've done along with the Dirac data engineering group at the University of Washington. We've developed a science platform based in the cloud that allows users to analyze data from large surveys. So first, why build these science platforms? And the simple answer is there's too much data going around in astronomy. Astronomy has recently become a data-driven field because of large surveys that take images of the entire sky at different wavelengths and at different cadences. And they produce very large data volumes that researchers then have to query and analyze in order to do their science. And unfortunately, there haven't been commensurate improvements in access to computing capacity to analyze these data. We can store the data, but it's not very easy to give users access to enough computers to analyze it. And second, astronomy has also become a query-driven science. A lot of this survey data, they're stored in archives, which are away from where the astronomers are, and they usually have to investigate that archive data through queries like SQL queries. The plot on the right shows the number of publications for the Hubble Space Telescope that uses archival data or new data. The orange and the green region shows the number of publications that are solely based on, or in part based on, archival data. And that takes up a large part of the science that's happening with the Hubble Space Telescope. And the current architectures that support this query-driven astronomy, they're not ideal. They currently expose these data through a web front end that the user accesses to grab data and then pull it onto their own computing resources. And this introduces an old problem in big data, which is that the computation is occurring far from the data. And we'd like to introduce future architectures to support this type of astronomy that is an old solution as well to bring the code to the data. And these are what science platforms are. They bring analysis resource to the data and expose rich web front ends to the user in order to access and visualize the data. And there's some remaining issues with these type of architectures. The main issue is that these current science platform concepts assume dedicated on-premise computing resources, which require large upfront investments by institutions and can often be very slow to adapt new technologies. Once you buy a computer, you have it until you buy another computer. And this still leaves data sets geographically distributed because the data archives themselves are geographically distributed. So it leaves a problem of an inefficiency in performing multi-dataset analysis without transferring terabytes of data across the internet. And it still remains a problem of, or there still is a problem of doing parallel queries on this data at the user level and at the infrastructure level, at the archives. One solution that we're proposing to this is to build an Astronomy Data Commons, which the idea behind this is to just co-locate all the data sets in the cloud. For example, a commercial cloud like Amazon Web Services or an academic cloud like Jetstream. And then once the data are co-located, let users and archives build services and platforms around the data. And that's what's being shown in this figure on the right. We use the cloud, or we propose using the cloud because when you use the cloud, you can use existing storage infrastructure. For example, cloud object stores offer scalable access to terabytes to petabytes of data very easily. And they often have existing computing infrastructure. You don't have to buy computers. You can just rent them and then give them away when you're done with them. And these cloud providers often update their technology as it comes out, which lead to improved compute nodes and managed services that you sort of get for free without ever putting in that investment. And what we're presenting here is an implementation of this idea, a gateway to data from the Zwicky Transient Facility. The data are 4 terabytes of data from this survey, the Zwicky Transient Facility, stored on Amazon Simple Storage Solution, which is a cloud object store. And this service is a JupyterHub built with tools able to query this data. Like I said, the data itself it takes up a data volume of 4 terabytes, and the data products are light curves produced by measurements of objects in the sky. The Zwicky Transient Facility is a survey that takes about 1,000 images per night of the sky, detects very many sources, and then measures their brightness. And then if you do that every single night, you can get a nice curve, a measurement of the brightness of an object over time. And we've taken the data release from the ZTF and put it on the cloud in Apache Parquet format for this system. And like I said, the science platform uses a JupyterHub and Jupyter notebooks to give users access to remote computing resources that are co-located with the data. Shown on the right is what one of these Jupyter notebooks looks like. You can easily execute code and visualize the results, and also you get full access to a terminal to execute arbitrary programs. We also include in the Jupyter Notebook servers software that allows the users to query the data in parallel very easily using Apache Spark and tools we've developed called the Astronomy extensions to Spark or Axis. And orchestrating these two parts, Jupyter and Apache Spark, is Kubernetes, which orchestrates these applications as Docker containers on a scalable cluster of virtual machines provided by Amazon EC2. We use Kubernetes as an orchestration layer because there's default support for it by Jupyter and Spark, Jupyter through the Zero JupyterHub project, and Spark through the Spark on Kubernetes API. And on the right here, I'm showing what the Kubernetes cluster looks like when a user accesses the system. A user will log into the JupyterHub through a proxy connected to the internet. The JupyterHub acts as an authentication layer. If the user is allowed to access the system, they get forwarded to a Jupyter Notebook server, which is a container running on the Kubernetes cluster. And then the user is given direct access to the Kubernetes API to create a Spark cluster that can then query the data. They can create one or more Spark executor containers that can execute queries on the data in parallel. And at any point in the process, if there aren't enough cluster resources, there aren't enough computers to accommodate requests for these notebook servers or these Spark executor pods, then another component called the cluster autoscaler will request new nodes to add to the Kubernetes cluster. And it'll also scale down the cluster when there are nodes that aren't in use. So we've actually had scientists use this platform to assist with a research project. This research project was looking for stars in the ZTF dataset that dip in their brightness. And this research project was unique because it required mining the entire dataset for discovery of these unique objects using custom code, which is an ideal use case for our platform. The science project was distributed into 2 stages, which could both be executed in parallel with Spark, using code written by the scientists, not by us, the developers. And on the right here, I'm showing a sort of filtered down or boiled down version of what this code looked like that the scientists wrote. First, there was a simple API exposed through the astronomy extensions to Spark that lets the user load the data. They were then able to apply a user-defined function to locate light curves that produce a dip and filter them out. And then also apply another user-defined function to fit these dipping light curves using a least squares fitting method. Again, both of these stages were executed entirely in parallel. And we found when the scientists who were using this platform, they were able to access many resources very easily. On the right here, I'm showing you some code that the scientists might have executed in order to gain access to the computing resources. They were able to allocate 96 EC2 instances in the Kubernetes cluster, creating a cluster of 768 cores with about 3 terabytes of RAM using just one line of code. And then they were able to complete their filtering query in 3 hours. And to illustrate my point, this is in comparison to 2 days on local hardware we have at the University of Washington. So you can see that you can get extreme levels of parallelism with little configuration that minimizes the time to science for these astronomers. And I also want to make the point that the access to computing is transparent and simple. Just by changing a few of these lines, you can configure the number of nodes, how much memory these nodes are getting, and how many threads are started on each of these nodes. And we set most of these to sensible defaults to smooth this process. And it's also important to mention that there are costs associated with using this platform, but they're minimized by using spot instances from EC2 and keeping data access within one AWS region. That's what we mean by co-locating the data with the compute resources. And for this one 3-hour query, it only cost about $100, which in comparison to a typical scientist salary is not very much. We've also built some accessibility tools to ease the transition to using Spark on this platform. We've built a custom Python API for interacting with Kubernetes. And we've also built a custom Jupyter Notebook extension to create Spark applications. I showed some code earlier on how to access the cluster of computers using Spark. And we're hoping to replace all of that with a simple start button to make it easier to gain access to these resources. So like I mentioned before, this is a single implementation of this Astronomy Commons idea where you co-locate data on the cloud and then build resources or build services that depend on computing resources next to the data that can access the data. And we're working with collaborators to make other data sets queryable with Spark and accessible via a platform like ours. For example, we're working with Ursa at IPAC, an institution at Caltech, to put their catalog, the NeoWise data set, on the cloud. And we're also working with MAST from the Space Telescope Science Institute, which supports the Hubble Space Telescope, to put their Pan-STARRS data set on the cloud as well. And it's important to mention that there are several challenges that remain to reduce the cost, transition legacy code, and ease the transition between different clouds. For the most part, the platform we've built is portable between different clouds because it relies on the Kubernetes infrastructure, not a specific cloud infrastructure. But there are still some things to work out. But yeah.
Your time is just about up.
Yep.
Aha! Good timing.
Thank you. I accept questions now.
Not a question really. This is Nancy Wilkins-Deere, but a comment on how nice the presentation was, and you actually answered questions that were coming up for me during the talk, which was what was the uptake looking like, what was the impact on the scientists' work, and so you answered those. I know astronomy is a field with some nice central organizations for sharing data. I'm going to forget the exact organizations right now, but the International Virtual Observatory used to be one. And I think there's a kind of an astronomical society of some sort. And I met someone at a Gateway related conference a few years ago who I think would be very interested in such things. And I wonder if you have any contacts like that. I can see if I can connect you from mine, but I wonder if in your day-to-day work, you're aware of kind of larger efforts like that, where this might fill a really nice need.
Yeah, I think there are several efforts sort of converging at the same time to implement the same idea of like co-locating the data. And we're working with a few of the people, like I mentioned at the end, but we always appreciate more context, more people we can get involved.
And I would like to bring one more question in. I have a question from Juan. He says, do you have any pushback from institutions for storing data on the cloud? And I was kind of along with this. Is this data that's stuff that is already existing in the cloud that's been put up there by somebody else? So do you have pushback about that?
Yeah, there is some pushback. I think a lot of archives aren't used to using the cloud, so there's sort of a technology cultural shift that has to happen. And I think there's also a little bit of a pushback in terms of like, I guess, co-locating all of the data. The data that we have here, we had to upload it ourselves, and we sort of were acting as the transition party or the sponsor for this data. But we're working on getting other archives to be that sponsor for their own data sets, storing them in the cloud.
Well, I'm going to put a hold on questions for this particular presentation right now, but we do have time at the end for more questions. So hold on to them if you've got them.